This is the second of 2 Black History Month lectures the Department of History is hosting this month. This event is also part of the Organization of Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I would like to thank, on behalf of the History Department, the co-sponsors for this event. They include the African and Black Diaspora Studies, American Studies, the Center for Black Diaspora, and the Women's Center. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Manisha Sinha. She is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. She received her PhD from Columbia University. Her research interests lie in the United States history, especially in transnational histories of slavery, abolition, and the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. She is the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, which was named one of the 10 best books on slavery in Politico 2015. Her lecture today will be based on The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which was featured in the editor's choice of the New York Times Book Review. The Slave's Cause has been reviewed by the Times Literary Supplement, New York Review of Books, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, BBC, the Christian Science Monitor, and The Atlantic, among other newspapers and journals. It was long listed for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. It was also named the Book of the Week by Times Higher Education in May to coincide with its UK publication. It received an honorable mention in the U.S. History category of the Prose Award and was named one of the 3 great history books by Stephen Carter in Bloomberg News. Dr. Sinha was awarded the Chancellor's Medal, the highest honor bestowed on faculty, and received the Distinguished Graduate Mentor Award in recognition of outstanding graduate teaching and advising at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she taught for over 20 years. Sinha appeared on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show in 2014, and she was an advisor and on-screen expert for the Emmy-nominated PBS documentary, The Abolitionists. We now have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Manisha Sinha, and she's also having a book signing afterwards back of the room. Can we give her a warm welcome, please?
So thank you so much for that welcome. It's good to see you all here. I know it's tempting today to be outside in Chicago. I know the feeling, and so I appreciate you all being here today in the afternoon. I just wanted to thank the History Department and all the different centers involved in co-sponsoring this talk and for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. As was mentioned earlier, I'm going to be talking about my new book on the History of Abolition. It's the new History of Abolition. If you think about the historiography of abolition, for a long time, abolitionists in American historiography had been portrayed as these extremists and fanatics who caused a needless civil war. And they're generally associated with, the moral reform and religious movements of the early 19th century. And many historians today, despite the fact that, their reputation was revived a little bit during the Civil Rights era as precursors of the Civil Rights movement, but that was quickly dismissed as neo-abolitionist history. And their reputation today amongst historians is really people who were economically conservative, tended to be racially paternalistic, etc. And so now what I wanted to do in this book was really reimagine the abolition movement as a radical interracial social movement that had a very important impact on the coming of emancipation during the Civil War. We normally don't think of it that way. We think of emancipation as a political process. And I know there's a Civil War seminar here who's held hostage to my talk, so I would make the case that abolitionists are really very, very crucial in putting emancipation on the political agenda, and the events of the Civil War help this agenda to be sort of pushed forward. And of course, one can't imagine the origins of the Republican Party without looking at the abolitionists. So what I'll do in my talk today is talk less about the war and emancipation, I'm sorry to say, but more about abolition as this sort of radical social movement. And I want to emphasize 2 things that I think the book does, which is somewhat different than previous history books on abolition. One is to really center not just African Americans, but center slave resistance in the history of abolition. Look at its impact on the movement. Look at the ways in which the enslaved themselves contributed to the abolition movement in pushing forward its goals of both abolition and black rights. And the second is the transnational aspect of abolitionism. The ways in which black and white abolitionists really sought to harness progressive international forces of their time against slavery. So let's begin with talking a little bit about slave resistance, the first part of the argument, right? So in this book I write that, only by writing African Americans free and enslaved out of its history can we view abolition as a white middle class movement burdened by racial paternalism and economic conservatism. Slave resistance, rather than sort of middle class white liberalism, lay at the heart of the abolition movement. It was constitutive of abolition rather than distinct from it. So to leave the enslaved out of the abolition movement is to, in fact, profoundly miss the part that they played in shaping its protest traditions and its goals. So the first wave of abolition dominated by, well, that's the cover of the book, but you'll be getting the white version of it because for some reason the press decided to change the cover for the paperback version. In any case, so the first wave of abolition, dominated by these early Quaker abolitionists, it grew in tandem with slave rebellions and instances of slaves running away in colonial America. In 1737, the hunchback Quaker vegetarian dwarf, one of my favorite figures, Benjamin Lay, wrote a philippic, "All slave keepers that keep the innocent in bondage are bastards." So this is going much further back from the Civil War era. I'm taking you back to 1737. He wrote that, quote, "Notorious lies that slaves are content will never go down well." And he listed instances of slave resistance as a sort of inspiration for his own radical abolitionism. And he was a pretty radical guy. I mean, he adopted a lot of these modern day protest tactics. And I'm glad to say that a new biography of his will be coming out soon. He, would stand barefoot in the snow to acquaint slaveholders with the ways in which they did not clad their slaves adequately during winter. He would throw pokeberry juice on the Bible and say it represented the blood of slaves. Smashed his wife's teacups, saying that, I will not have sugar because it is produced with the blood of slaves. As sugar was indeed the first sort of cash crop, very crucial to the growth of the early world market, and it was produced by slave labor. Even the preeminent Quaker abolitionist Anthony Benezet, pictured here in the school that he opened for black children in Philadelphia, attributed his abolitionist beliefs to the devastation wrought by the slave trade on West Africa and on hearing first-hand accounts of it from Africans. And he was pretty careful in the way he critiqued the slave trade. He acknowledged, in fact, African participation in the slave trade, but argued that, in fact, Africa was the net loser when it came to the impact of the trade. So Quaker abolitionists like Lay, like Benezet, and John Woolman, pictured there, someone should write a new biography of his. There are a number of biographies of his, but I think he deserves a new one. Now, Woolman, who wrote A Plea for the Poor, besides his pamphlets against slavery, subsumed their criticism of slavery under a broader critique of warfare, wealth-making, and commerce. So far from justifying inequality or wage labor, which is the way abolitionists were commonly viewed, and just sort of honing down their criticism to slavery, their criticism of slavery allowed them to develop critiques of poverty, as far as Woolman was concerned, against environmental destruction, inequality, the problems with early industrialization too. And in that sense, this guy's writing in the 18th century, they were fairly far-sighted. Now, besides rebellions, conspiracies, and running away, the enslaved deployed various anti-slavery strategies, at times petitioning and suing for their freedom. So Judge Samuel Sewell was inspired to write the first anti-slavery pamphlet in Massachusetts in 1700, The Selling of Joseph, on reading an African couple's petition for freedom. Now, everyone knows about Sewall's pamphlet, but I think what was important for me was that when Sewall explained where did he get this motivation to write this pamphlet, he actually pointed to this African couple's petition. Now, Sewall was also, of course, involved in the sale of witchcraft trials, and he later regretted his role in that, and I think kind of redeemed himself a little bit by writing this pamphlet. Now, in England, fugitive slaves recruited the services of the British abolitionist Granville Sharp in their freedom suits against their masters. The most famous, of course, was in the decision of James Somerset in 1772, which denied colonial slaveholders the prerogative to forcibly transport their slaves out of Britain. Most African Americans and abolitionists interpreted that case as resulting in the abolition of slavery in Britain and used it in that manner. And in fact, this case is so important because it would be evoked by generations of Northern anti-slavery lawyers and politicians to establish the freedom principle in the Northern states. A runaway slave instigated a historic anti-slavery ruling, and it is only fitting that his name graces this important Anglo-American judicial decision. Now, growing numbers of freedom suits during the American Revolution, particularly the court cases of Quaker and Mumbet, or Elizabeth Freeman, and she's pictured there on the top left, led to the judicial abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in 1783. And my students at UMass are always amazed when I told them that slavery was abolished in the Commonwealth, not because of any law, not because of some decision handed down, but really because two ordinary slaves had sued for their freedom. Now, the tradition of freedom suits and invoking the freedom principle of Somerset continued right down to the well-known Dred Scott decision of 1857. But of course, in this case, the plaintiff was unsuccessful. Now, it is important to note that African Americans' freedom claims inaugurated the first emancipation in the Western world, abolition in the northern states of the American Republic. Blacks in Massachusetts petitioning for their freedom formed themselves into, quote, an anti-slavery committee in 1773, and you could say that this is the first known instance of an abolition society. Another group, the Sons of Africa, modeled most likely after the Sons of Liberty, was the organizational moniker that they and Afro-British abolitionists and former slaves such as Olathe Equiano and Atoba Kugano adopted for their anti-slave trade petitions in the 1780s and 1790s. You may have heard of Equiano and his narrative and the controversy surrounding it. I am not going to address it because it's in the book. And if you want to know about it, you can read the book. So, Black abolitionists and writers went beyond a simple appeal to American republicanism to be included in its revolutionary promise. They generated a powerful abolitionist critique of the slaveholding republic. As the young enslaved poet Phyllis Wheatley, and this is of course the frontispiece of her poems published in London in 1773, as she wrote in a letter widely published in New England newspapers, quote, "By the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle, love of freedom, lives in us. How well the cry for liberty and reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power where others agree, I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine." Now, one can only imagine if Jefferson was stunned by her allusion because he had deemed her poetry, quote, beneath criticism. So the enslaved fight for freedom gave Anglo-American abolition its first organizational expression. On April 14, 1775, 10 Quakers, under the leadership of the English-born tailor Thomas Harrison, formed the Society for the Relief of Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. And this is a fanciful 19th century representation of that founding moment. And it's interesting to know that these guys, well, many of them were tailors or sailors like Benjamin Lay, or indentured servants themselves. These are not bourgeois abolitionists shedding crocodile tears of the slaves. Many of them actually belong to that class of society that could really empathize sometimes with the woes of the slaves. So this society meant to help a woman of mixed Indian and African heritage from New Jersey interned in a workhouse, Dinah Neville and her 4 children. The very title of the society suggests the ways in which black efforts to gain freedom spurred abolitionist organization. Now, more than the American Revolution and its aftermath, which inaugurated the long emancipation in the North, you might know that most northern states abolished slavery after the Revolution by passing these long-term gradual emancipation laws that freed children of slaves after a long period until they reached adulthood. So more than the American Revolution, northern emancipation, the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804 constitutes a landmark in the history of abolition. Now, this bloody and decisive challenge to slavery and white supremacy, notwithstanding Haiti's subsequent poverty and political instability, and which was actually aggravated by the colonial policies of its erstwhile enemies and rulers, this revolution became sanctified in abolitionist memory. So more than talking about the revolution, I was really interested in the ways in which abolitionists understood the revolution. This is not just true of the French abolitionists, because Haiti was a French colony, and the Société des Mines et Noirs, which supported the fight for citizenship rights for free people of color, and later the abolition of slavery, but also the British movement to abolish the slave trade. So Thomas Clarkson, pictured here on the left, wrote one of the earliest defenses of slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue in 1792, and Haiti named one of its man-of-wars Wilberforce, after the British parliamentarian. So not only are these British abolitionists visualizing Haiti as part of their movement, you know, here are abolitionists who are seen as conservative in their politics, etc., kind of vindicating slave rebellion, and a bloody one at that, like Haiti's. But Haiti itself was seeing itself part of this broader movement, right? You know, for them to name a man of war after the British abolitionists was taking a claim to that movement. In the United States, Abraham Bishop asked anti-slavery societies to assist the slave rebels with, quote, the pen, the tongue, the counsel, the sword, and money. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society, as the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, was renamed after the Revolution, and the New York Manumission Society, now made famous because of Hamilton, which I believe is running in Chicago, no luck in getting tickets while I was here, helped free Haitian slaves by actually bringing fleeing masters under the purview of their state emancipation laws. So when Haitian masters tried to flee the revolution, come to the United States with their slaves, if they landed in the South, all was well and good. They were welcomed by many slaveholding states. But if they landed in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, or in New York, abolitionist societies many times took up their cases in the courts and helped free them. So in fact, many of them actually tried to sell their slaves quickly down south because they wanted to avoid those emancipation laws. Now, with the rise of interracial immediatism in the 19th century, abolitionists often evoked the Haitian Revolution. David Walker, arguably the author of the first radical abolitionist pamphlet of the second phase, this is the 19th century, in his pamphlet, Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, published in 1829, called Haiti, quote, the glory of the blacks and the terror of tyrants. Now, Walker had propounded various anti-slavery strategies, including that of sort of racial uplift, etc. But it's interesting that this did not exclude or preclude him championing a sort of more radical vision of abolition. And he, like many black and white abolitionists, especially of the later phase, tended to laud Haiti. Now, William Lloyd Garrison published an imaginary dialogue between Washington and Toussaint Louverture, who was the leader of the Haitian Revolution. And he wrote a sympathetic history of Haiti, which he claimed, quote, has been so misunderstood and misrepresented, affords unanswerable evidence for immediate abolition. Now, mind you, Garrison was a pacifist. He believed in nonviolent means. And here he is lauding Haiti and Walker to a certain extent right from the start. And he, of course, published his famous abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, in Boston from 1831 to 1865, right up to the end of the Civil War. Once the 13th Amendment was passed, he was like, I'm done. You know, I'm ceasing publication, though other abolitionists kind of disagreed with him. This is actually one of my favorite portraits of Garrison, because it was done by a black abolitionist artist in Philadelphia, Robert Douglas Jr., who belonged to a very prominent black abolitionist family in Philadelphia. But what you have in the 1820s and 1830s is really the start of this immediatist movement, where they are rejecting the sort of gradual emancipation laws and asking for the immediate abolition of slavery with no compensation to slaveholders. They argue if anyone deserves compensation, it is the slaves for years of unrequited labor. Now, the turn to immediatism in the Anglo-American world coincided with and was inspired by major instances of slave rebellion. So in Britain, the Quaker abolitionist Elizabeth Herrick, unknown to most historians, and she's actually always pinpointed as the first call for immediate abolition. She published this pamphlet, Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition, in 1824. That's the first call for abolition. So where does she get this idea from? And if you dig deep, you find out, as most historians have ignored, I would say, that she coupled her call for immediate abolition in this pamphlet with a passionate defense of the huge Demerara slave rebellion of 1823. In fact, if you go towards the end of this pamphlet, it's all about the slave rebellion in Demerara. Herrick is important also because I think it shows that right from the start, and before her, of course, there were many others too, women were involved in the abolition movement, and they are generally disfranchised, right, at that point. They are not exactly citizens with political rights. So I think it highlights women's roles too, because Herrick, besides this pamphlet, wrote many other pamphlets, and one of them was kind of a defense of women's participation in the abolition movement and of women's rights. So right from the 1820s onwards, you can actually trace the roots of women's politicization within the abolition movement and their contribution to the 19th century women's rights movement. Now in 1831, and I won't go again into details about all the rebellions that took place in the 1820s that sort of coalesced into this kind of militant black abolitionism of the 1820s. In that sense, Walker is not an exception as he's normally seen. He was really part of this movement of black writers and slave rebels of the 1820s. Now in 1831, two major slave revolts shook the foundations of Anglo-American slavery. Coming at the heels of the publication of Garrison's Liberator, Nat Turner's No Quarters Given Rebellion, it became irrevocably linked to the birth of radical abolitionism. And this is a contemporary illustration of Turner being discovered in the woods. Remarking on the suppression of Turner's rebellion, the pacifist Garrison wrote, quote, "A dastardly triumph, well becoming a nation of oppressors," unquote. So again, this dichotomy that we have, that somehow white abolitionists were pacifists and were very reluctant to support violent slave rebellion, really is not true if you read the historical record carefully. So even Garrison, who said, "No violent means for me, I reject violence completely. I will try to persuade people, moral suasion against slavery," he understood why slaves would choose to rebel against their conditions. So while slave rebellion prompted debates over emancipation in Virginia, and this is important to remember, that in 1831, it was not as if Turner had this kind of nihilistic, violent rebellion and it was all over. Sometimes it is portrayed that way in Southern history. But actually Turner's rebellion did lead to, the first time since the Revolutionary era, debates over emancipation in the Virginia legislature. Now, it failed, the attempt failed, but the fact is that that was the political significance of his rebellion, that political historians and those who talk about the coming of the Civil War need to pay attention to. And certainly most Virginian authorities understood the impact that his rebellion had. So in Virginia, not only are people using the rebellion to argue for emancipation, but you also have a kind of a pro-slavery answer to the rebellion. So already you can see that contestation over slavery being precipitated by slave rebellion. So even though Turner's rebellion actually led to these debates, which was not successful in Virginia, slave rebellion actually precipitated British abolition. The charismatic Samuel Daddy Sharp, pictured there on the left, led the so-called Baptist War or Christmas Rebellion in Jamaica involving nearly 60,000 slaves. Abolitionist minister Henry Bleavey noted that the revolt and its brutal suppression dealt, quote, a death wound to colonial slavery and accelerated its destruction. Now again, those of you in the Civil War seminar, you know that some of the new ways that we are looking at the American Civil War is to trace its transnational roots and connections, right? And I would say, you know, Sharpe's Rebellion and British abolition are extremely crucial to understanding that, and there are a number of books that make that case. So, abolitionist minister, did I already read that? Henry Bleavey? No? Okay, abolitionist minister Henry Bleavey noted, thank you. No problem. Should drink another cup of coffee and run. Abolitionist minister Henry Bleavey noted that the revolt and its brutal suppression dealt, quote, a death wound to colonial slavery and accelerated its destruction. 1 week after Sharpe's execution in 1832, Parliament appointed a select committee to explore the expediency of, quote, effecting the extinction of slavery throughout the British dominions. And indeed, Britain does end up abolishing slavery in 1833. Now, there were other factors that led to abolition in Britain. The Great Reform Act, which liberalized voting in Britain. It's always a good idea to increase the boundaries of voting rather than restrict them. And also abolitionist agitation, all those petition campaigns that had taken place in Britain. But Sharpe's Rebellion was clearly the catalyst that led to abolition in Britain. Now, the connection between slave resistance and abolition in the United States was proximate and continuous. It gave abolition its most enduring issue, the fugitive slave controversy, and provided the movement with its most dynamic exponents, fugitive slave abolitionists. Now, this is the illustration of a runaway slave that pretty much graced American newspapers right from the colonial era down to the Civil War. It was the image of the runaway slave that accompanied advertisements, advertising basically for runaway slaves. And in fact, abolitionists like Theodore Weld used this as abolitionists. In abolitionist literature, they would use these advertisements and simply reproduce them as an indictment of slavery without saying anything. He actually had a book called American Slavery as It Is, where he just reprinted runaway slave advertisements from Southern newspapers, and many times they would describe slaves with, stripes on their backs or with a ear half cut off. I mean, the brutalities of slavery were evident in slaveholders' descriptions of their slaves that had run away. So, slave resistance revolutionized abolitionist discourse and practice and moved abolition into northern states and courthouses. Northern personal liberty laws and attempts to grant fugitives trial by jury and prevent the kidnapping of free blacks into slavery. Some of you may have seen that Solomon Northup movie. If you haven't read the narrative, I recommend the narrative too. These instances of kidnapping of free blacks into slavery and attempts to prevent them challenge the extraterritoriality of Southern slave codes, which is trying to make Southern slave codes valid in the North, mandated by the federal fugitive slave laws. Now, enslaved, quote, freedom seekers contributed to the breakdown of comedy between northern and southern states, a dress rehearsal for their momentous actions during the Civil War, where they helped initiate the emancipation process by voting with their feet and defecting to Union Army lines in large numbers. So what I'm saying here is that when we look at emancipation during the Civil War and we understand this movement of slaves to the Union Army, we should understand this as the last phase of an ongoing movement that began in the colonial era with fugitives seeking out free spaces, whether it was in the North, sometimes in Mexico. We have increasingly good new work coming out on fugitive slaves who made their ways to Mexico after Mexico abolished slavery in the 1820s. Fugitive slaves who made their ways to Indian territory, some who stowed all the way to Britain in ships, seeking free spaces. So we have to understand this movement, this prehistory to emancipation. I would call that historians sometimes ignore even when they look at the ways in which the enslaved saw the Union Army and Lincoln as their liberators before they saw themselves in that role. So, I think I made the Civil War connection there, right? Now, the first black abolitionist petitions and letters, we'll go back in time here, authored by Absalom Jones, pictured here, Richard Allen, and James Forten, concerned the fugitive slave law and the kidnapping of free blacks. In fact, slave catchers tried to even kidnap Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who were leaders of the pre-black community in Philadelphia. You should also know that they were the ones who founded the historic AME Church that was attacked in Charleston 2 years ago. Now, outstanding individual abolitionists like Quakers, Isaac T. Harper in that typical Quaker hat, Levi Coffin, who was known as the president of the Underground Railroad, Thomas Garrett, pictured here in this newspaper article. He actually helped Harriet Tubman escape slavery, and John Rankin of Ohio, whose careers kind of bridged the two waves of abolition, the Revolutionary era and the pre-Civil War era, made assistance to fugitive slaves a quintessential form of abolitionist activism. In the first 2 decades of the 19th century, Benjamin Lundy, again a Quaker abolitionist who was a saddle maker, again, not continuing this tradition of, humble origins, really. Quaker bankers, let's say, were not very active in the abolitionist movement, as it's been falsely called, I think. So Quaker abolitionists like Benjamin Lundy, under whom Garrison served an apprenticeship, and African Americans in Ohio, Philadelphia, and I'm saying that actually not in a figurative sense. He was not literally an apprentice of Lundy, but he joined him in editing his newspaper before he began his own newspaper. So abolitionists like Lundy and African Americans in Ohio, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Boston formed, quote, humane and protection societies against kidnapping. And this is happening, in the 1820s and all, when we think that there was no abolitionist activity at all. No, if you look deep down, if you look at the local levels, you can still find African Americans mobilizing around these issues and forming these abolitionist societies. Now, black abolitionists established the organizational apparatus of what came to be known as the Underground Railroad, the Vigilance Committees of the 1830s. David Ruggles, secretary of the New York Committee of Vigilance, founded in 1835, he's pictured there with Isaac Harper, and Barney Gose of the Old New York Manumission Society, which was still active at that time, was most responsible for this tactical innovation. Ruggles was. Calling themselves, quote, the Friends of Human Rights, the Committee of Vigilance assisted fugitive slaves and rescued kidnapped Southern and local free blacks. They enslaved in ships involved in the illegal international slave trade, because both Britain and the United States had abolished slavery, the slave trade in 1808, and slaves in transit with their Southern masters. Often denied legal rights by their enslavers and law enforcement officials in cahoots with them, the committee hired anti-slavery lawyers to represent African Americans caught between slavery and freedom. They successfully petitioned the New York State government for the right to trial by jury, and these black vigilance committees soon spread all over the North, including amongst fugitive slave communities in Canada. Now, here are some of the prominent black abolitionists who formed these local sort of black vigilance committees. Robert Purvis in Philadelphia. He was actually one of the founding members of Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society. Jermaine Lagoon in Syracuse. He was a fugitive slave himself, and he famously said, the fugitive slave law outlaws me, and therefore I outlaw it. He was, quite a man. Then Stephen Myers, along with his wife Harriet Myers in Albany. New York, they formed the Albany Vigilance Committee. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture or portrait of his wife. Lewis Hayden, who was also a fugitive slave, who was very active in the Boston Vigilance Committee. And William Still in Philadelphia, who wrote the first history of the Underground Railroad after the Civil War in the 1830s. So these black vigilance committees were precursors of the interracial vigilance committees that led the shock troops involved in the famous fugitive slave rescues before the Civil Wars. And I call them fugitive slave rebellions of the 1850s. And I'm just going to mention a few of them which I think are significant. There are many more. described in the book, and they're actually quite exciting stories. I mean, it's amazing if you think of the things they did. When you're talking today about, you know, resistance to unjust laws, etc., you could say that it is quite an interesting aspect of the abolition movement. So there was, of course, first the Christiana riot, which resulted in the death of a Maryland slaveholder, and most of the defendants there actually got out free. The leader escaped to Canada, but most of the defendants got out free, mainly because they were represented by Thaddeus Stevens, who you'll hear more and more about during the Civil War. This is what he did before he became active as an advocate for black rights during Reconstruction. So they got off after this sort of big uprising, defending themselves against Maryland slave catchers. Then there was the Oberlin Wellington rescue of John Price, which is significant because many of the people involved there ended up going with John Brown to Harper's Ferry. Showing how all this kind of abolitionist activism of the 1850s and these kind of outright rebellions virtually against the enforcement of the new federal fugitive slave law of the 1850s is really important in terms of understanding radicalization within the abolitionist movement. And then you had Anthony Burns, who was remanded from Boston, and the president had to actually send in federal troops to Boston to enforce the fugitive slave law. It was a very big victory because it outraged, of course, everyone in Boston. And then there was even those who were actually somewhat pro-slavery before this happened, Burns. It was the first time that the abolitionists actually got sort of mass sympathy from the citizens of Boston because they didn't want to become slave patrollers. And then the famous case of Joshua Glover, which I think is actually the most significant case in terms of understanding the coming of the Civil War. You know, Glover escaped to Canada from Wisconsin, from Racine, Wisconsin. But the people who assisted him, mainly abolitionists, they were tried in Wisconsin courts, and their case went right up to the state Supreme Judicial Court of Wisconsin, which declared the federal law unconstitutional and basically nullified the federal fugitive slave law on the eve of the Civil War. So when you talk about the coming of the Civil War, we tend to emphasize the conflict over the expansion of slavery in the territories. But I would argue that in terms of like an immediacy and in terms of the ways in which it was reported in northern newspapers, the fugitive slave controversy caused by fugitive slaves themselves, there would have been no fugitive slave issue if they weren't fugitive slaves actually running away from slavery. I don't care if there were 10 or 1,000 a year, as the US Census documented, or many more, as historians now are arguing. The fact remains that each time you had a controversy over a particular slave, a slave ran away, it was an irritant. It was a sexual irritant and actually contributed, you could say, to the final confrontation during the Civil War. Okay, so long before the fugitive slave crisis of the 1850s, abolitionists, including Garrisonian non-resistance, that was a radical form of non-violence that Garrison believed in. He thought the state, no one should use violence, right? He was sort of he was seen as this sort of extreme version of commitment to non-violence. So including Garrisonian non-resistance justified the actions of slaves who stole themselves, fought back in self-defense, and slave rebels. Now, fugitive slaves were not only active in the vigilance committees, but breathed fresh air into the movement, driven by a schism between Garrisonians and political and evangelical abolitionists over political action, religious perfectionism, and women's rights. So the abolition movement tended to split by the 1840s between various wings, political, evangelical, Garrisonians, who tended to be more radical on issues of political action, religion, anti-church, and also women's rights. But when it came to a fugitive slave, all these factions would come together and assist each other. And that's, again, showing you the impact, I think, a little bit of slave resistance on the movement. Now, some like Harriet Tubman, pictured here on the top left, also started, as you know, running off slaves. She was supposed to grace our $20 bill, but I think Andrew Jackson is back in fashion, so may not happen, folks. But some like Harriet Tubman also started running off slaves, venturing into the South, and suffering imprisonment and worse for their troubles. Now, Tubman, of course, was never caught, but here are the sort of unknown abolitionists who were, and just a few of them, there are many more in the book. Charles Torrey, Massachusetts abolitionist who died in a Maryland jail for assisting fugitive slaves. Calvin Fairbanks, who was pretty much in a Kentucky jail till he was freed during the Civil War. George Thompson, who was imprisoned in Missouri, and he was active here in Illinois, in the Missouri-Illinois border. He was imprisoned in Missouri, became a celebrity for his imprisonment because he wrote a prison memoir that became very popular. He eventually went to Africa with the Amistad slave rebels to start the Mending Mission there. And many of the people whom he taught in Africa came back to the US during Reconstruction to help in freedmen's schools, showing you the transnational radicalism and these kind of networks that were formed, not just with Europe at this time, but also with Africa. And then, of course, there was Jonathan Walker, who was a Massachusetts sea captain. His hand was branded SS in Florida as standing for slave stealer, for having assisted fugitive slaves. And this is an actual photograph of his hand. I don't know if you can see the SS there. It's kind of a little blurry. Now, shipboard rebellions, like the Amistad and the Creole, these were shipboard rebellions of slaves who were being transported either in the international or domestic slave trade, also united the abolition movement and had a significant impact on the national politics of slavery and international law and diplomacy. Soon, not just abolitionists like Garrett Smith, pictured here on your top right, and that, of course, is a portrait of Cinque, who led the Amistad slave rebellion. Some of you might have seen the movie, right? But that portrait was commissioned by a black abolitionist, Robert Purvis, whom you saw earlier, and it was done by the brother of a white abolitionist, Simeon Jocelyn. His name was Nathaniel Jocelyn. Just showing you how this kind of interracial network worked in producing art and cultural work, material work, the pamphlet literature of abolitionism. So soon, not just abolitionists like Smith and William Jay, who is, of course, the son of the founding father, John Jay, Garrison, and the black abolitionist minister, Henry Highland Garnet, who wrote the famous Address to the Slaves in 1843. Soon, not just they were defending the slaves' right to rebel, but also anti-slavery politicians, like John Quincy Adams, the former president and who later became a representative from Massachusetts, who represented the Amistad rebels in the Supreme Court and defended abolitionist petitions in Congress when they were being gagged. There are all kinds of connections, the gagging of certain senators today using arcane rules, that has a long history. Abolitionist petitions were being gagged using those gag rules. I wrote a piece on this for CNN. They actually solicited it from me. They said, can you tell us a little bit about the gag rules of the 19th century? Because people are being gagged now. I'm like, sure, I'll do that. Any attention to these guys, I'm happy to give, Anyway, so John Quincy Adams and Joshua R. Giddings of Ohio, who defended the Creole slave rebels in Congress, and he was censured for that. And had to resign his seat, and he was elected by his abolitionist constituency in Ohio. He was censured for his defense of the Creole slave rebels. Now, it's important to know that the Creole Rebellion was led by a guy, and you can't make this stuff up, right? His name was Madison Washington. I mean, literally. And what's interesting about him is that he had actually escaped slavery. He had gone to Canada through these abolitionists, through the abolitionist underground. And when he came back to Virginia, he came back to rescue his wife, who was still enslaved. He was caught and shipped in the domestic slave trade of the United States from Norfolk, Virginia to Louisiana. He led this rebellion, steered the ship to the British West Indies, and of course, he and most of his compatriots were set free by the British authorities because they did not recognize slavery. And this became a thorn in Anglo-American diplomacy right down to the Civil War. They were arguing about the Creole slave rebels and getting compensation for them. And the US government was representing Southern slaveholders in this right down to the Civil War. So in vindicating the slaves' right to rebellion, abolitionist legal theory, often dismissed as, quote, higher law theory, made human rights an essential attribute of domestic and international law, because abolitionists said absolutely not. We should not be demanding compensation for these slave rebels. They have just exercised their natural rights to be free. So the spectacular confrontations between fugitive slaves and their abolitionist allies and slaveholders who deployed the entire oppressive machinery of the state against them in the decade before the war, built on the legal, political, and grassroots abolitionist activism inspired by slave resistance. So in the context of the abolitionist underground, John Brown's raid into Harper's Ferry in 1859 was hardly the action of an aberrant or lone wolf abolitionist. I mean, Brown is often portrayed as this insane guy, this maniac, right? He was never portrayed that way by African Americans, who always lauded the white man willing to die for black freedom. But we must understand John Brown's raid in the context of this long history of abolitionist activism. We must, moderates like Lincoln, kind of distance themselves a little bit from Brown. Now, fugitive slaves in particular remade the abolition movement. A new generation of fugitive slave abolitionists, like, of course, most famously, Frederick Douglass, who we all know is doing an amazing job. I'm sorry, So Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, who was an abolitionist writer of some repute, Henry Box Brown, who is not pictured here, but he was the slave who shipped himself to freedom, right? He actually had himself parceled. He was in Virginia, he boxed himself up, shipped himself to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society office. Now, anyone who says that the enslaved lacked political sophistication or were not aware of what was happening outside the plantation, you know, should pay attention to some of these stories. The fact that he knew that he could ship himself to the anti-slavery offices is actually quite remarkable. And then some tried to imitate him, but then they've already wised to it and got caught. Henry Babe, who published this newspaper called Voice of the Fugitive from Canada. In fact, Douglass's first newspaper was also significantly called North Star, again showing the relevance of fugitive slave abolitionism. They became not only abolition's most effective emissaries, but their popular slave narratives also constituted the movement's literature, providing an effective riposte to the increasingly theoretical sophistication of the pro-slavery argument. Now, I know a lot of people, literary scholars, have sometimes, you know, sort of dismissed some of these narratives as having been ghostwritten by white abolitionists or having white abolitionist editors sort of include abolitionist content. But that really, I argue in my book, sort of is somewhat condescending toward these fugitive slaves abolitionists who are making these amazing abolitionist speeches at that time. The fact that somehow the abolitionist content of their narratives is not of their own making, I would, you know, kind of dispute that a little bit. So their slave narratives were really the movement literature, and so there is a kind of an ideological argument going on about slavery in which African Americans are participating, even though, you know, an overwhelming majority of them are enslaved and disfranchised. In the North, you know, most northern states don't give them the right to vote, except for a handful of New England states. So now, besides them, of course, you might have heard of course, Harriet Jacobs, who wrote the iconic female slave narrative. Her narrative was seen as authentic fairly recently, 1980s. Samuel Ringgold Ward, who not only became a very prominent political abolitionist who fought for the Liberty Party, that was a short-lived abolitionist party that eventually made way for the Free Soil and Republican parties. He went on to Canada, London, and then to the British West Indies, where he died in Jamaica. William and Ellen Craft, do you know their story? You do? Good. Most of you know it? No? But I think it's an interesting story, and it was considered famous then because she was very light-skinned. She dressed up as a slaveholder, and her husband pretended to be her slave. And they escaped all the way from Savannah, Georgia, to Boston, Massachusetts. Not on the underground, but the overground railroad, fooling everyone. Finally, their masters got wise to them. They sent slave catchers after them in Boston. And they escaped from Boston. They went to Canada and then went to England, telling everyone of their remarkable escape. And after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, again, this is something we don't follow up, and we always think, oh, the Abolition, they just kind of disappear after the Civil War. I'm writing a book now on Reconstruction that I'm trying to reconstruct some of this stuff, literally. They actually made their way back to Georgia during Reconstruction and opened, got a hold of a plantation and experimented with opening a school for free people, etc. So, again, ongoing activism even through and after the war. And then one of my favorite people, James W.C. Pennington, who was a fugitive slave. He's the first black man to receive an honorary doctorate. He got an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in 1849 in theology. He became a clergyman, a fugitive slave, pretty much self-taught, attended theology classes at Yale. They wouldn't let him sit in the classroom. They made him sit in a corner. But he eventually, was the author of some very famous books. Besides his own slave narrative, he published one of the best sort of arguments against scientific racism at that time, using kind of a religious argument against, Christian argument against scientific racism. So in 2011, when Heidelberg celebrated its 625th anniversary, they actually endowed a fellowship in his name. And since there are not many people, there are a couple of biographies of him actually out there, but there are not many people who know about him. They invited me to speak on that occasion. And President Obama actually sent his congratulations and likened his own story to that of Pennington and said, this is where you come from and this is where you end up, kind of thing, which is kind of interesting. But in any case, going back to this point about slave narratives, these are a few of the authors of the famous slave narratives of that time. Harriet Beecher Stowe drew on them for her runaway, pun intended, international bestseller, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, when Southerners challenged Stowe's portrayal of slavery in her novel, she published a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin the next year, right? In 1853, and she listed the slave narratives that had inspired her, right? So you can't, make these things up. She literally herself acknowledged how and she was a colonizationist. She was not an abolitionist. She believed that free black people should be sent back to Africa, so she was a bit of a racialist. But she actually listed all the slave narratives that had helped her to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, again showing you the impact of what I call the movement literature of abolition. So an admiring report on Douglass's speech, published in The Liberator in 1844, best captures the significance of fugitive slave abolitionism. Douglass, the writer, fantasized, was, quote, an insurgent slave, taking hold the right of speech and charging on his tyrants the bondage of his race. Now, Douglass became, of course, the most famous of them because of his lecture tours here and abroad, and his narratives that he wrote and rewrote in 3 different editions, and his newspapers, the North Star, which became the Frederick Douglass's newspaper. So, I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking that, maybe I shouldn't inflict on you the second half of this lecture, which looks more at what I had said I was going to do at the outset, which is looking at the transnational aspects of abolition, the ways in which abolitionists use feminism, the communitarian movement, which is a movement to form communities to address the problems of early industrialization and the rise of market society, the labor movement, movements for immigrant rights, Native American rights, for movements against capital punishment. I mean, the more I researched this book, I saw that abolitionists were involved in all kinds of things. You can see Garrison writing against the criminalization of blackness, and this is a contemporary issue, right? I found connections between abolitionists and anti-imperialism, against British imperialism. And this was really interesting because most abolitionists were very enamored of the British abolitionists, but they were very critical of British imperialism in Asia and later on in Africa, in the scramble for Africa, and in the late 19th century. So all that is in the book. And even though it looks big and daunting, I've heard it's not a bad read. If you persisted, it's not. I wrote it in a manner that would not put you to sleep. So hopefully you will get a chance to read it. So I'm going to skip that entire part and going to end with just sort of reminding you that abolition expanded rather than contracted radical horizons. Abolitionists, for the most part, challenged rather than shored up the status quo. From women's rights, the abolition of capital punishment, the peace movement. There was a peace movement in the 19th century. The immigrant and working men's rights, the rights of native populations trampled by European settlers and imperialism. Abolitionists linked the slaves' cause to a variety of causes. Abolitionist ideas on racial inequality are a starting point in an interracial discourse of democratic radicalism in the modern world. Their concerns relentlessly internationalist and eclectic. The struggle against slavery did not normalize or rationalize other forms of injustice, but gave birth to diverse radical passions. So I'm just giving you the conclusion. I can elaborate in the question and answer session if you want me to kind of prove that argument, right? It was the eclipse rather than the triumph of the abolitionist mentalité after the fall of Reconstruction that led to the most egregious crimes against humanity at home in the United States. We think about lynching, sharecropping, etc., debt peonage, convict labor, and abroad, if you think about the rise of European and Western imperialism at the turn of the 19th and early 20th century. So thank you so much for listening patiently.
Sure that Dr. Sinha would love to take questions from you all.
Absolutely.
Would you like to ask some?
But and looking into your background, I discovered that you worked from the United States initially, and that I feel like this is such a U.S. focused topic that I was really interested in how you got into it. Just the Civil War is an American obsession.
Right.
Yeah.
How did I get obsessed with
Yeah.
that? Right. So, I actually grew up in India, right? I got my bachelor's degree in India and then came here to graduate school because I wanted to study slavery, Civil War stuff, right? American history. And I think for a lot of us growing up in Asia and Africa, other parts of the world, in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, with Martin Luther King kind of evoking Gandhian notions of resistance, nonviolent resistance, we were also interested in issues of race and citizenship in the US. And so I read much of the material surrounding the Civil Rights Movement, the autobiography of Malcolm X, Stride Towards Freedom, Letter from Birmingham Jail, all those books, I read them, sort of growing up in India. And I kind of worked my way back to slavery and the Civil War and became kind of a 19th century historian, and I've been here since. So that's the personal anecdote.
Yeah.
Yeah, any other questions? Don't be shy.
I have one, if I could.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering if you'd just take a minute. I believe that Massachusetts Supreme Court decision was the only case in which slavery was ended as declared unconstitutional. I think in the pre-Civil War period. I think it's the only state that declared it unconstitutional, but I don't know if that's absolutely. Is that right?
Well, yeah, sort of, because Vermont, of course, abolished slavery first. Vermont was always there first.
Right,
absolutely. Right, in 1777, and so they have it in their constitution.
Okay, so when they made their constitution, their constitution was slave-free.
They abolished slavery, but even then, I argue in the book that was not sufficient, because even in Vermont, we have cases of African Americans suing for their freedom to implement that constitutional restriction. So it's not just enough to make the law, you know, it has to be implemented, and that's when you can see how, you know, high politics and politics on the ground, you know, in terms of these radical social movements or ordinary people sort of taking up their cases or going to the local anti-slavery lawyer to be represented in court is really important. So yeah, Vermont. And the other case that I would say is New Hampshire. New Hampshire is really weird because they never have a judicial decision or a law abolishing slavery. But slavery kind of dies out. And they have like 450 African Americans in the state, and it kind of dies out because there are many freedom petitions from New Hampshire. It's part of that whole New England black petitioning, etc. But in the 1850s, they finally realized that they didn't have a law. So they clarified slavery is not legal in New Hampshire, but it kind of dies with sort of activism on the ground, with kind of sort of understood that slavery is not legal. So probably with the understanding that maybe, and there are some judicial decisions. So New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts are the three, I would say.
And in the Massachusetts case, could you describe what the court, how the court came to its position? On what grounds did it make its decision?
So this is what is interesting about it. The two cases, Quaker, Walker, and Mumbet, right? They're suing for their freedom, and they're not alone, because you see this uptick in slaves suing for their freedom in the 1760s and 1770s. So revolutionary, you know, the rhetoric of natural rights, and they immediately take a hold of that and apply it to themselves. And Jeremy Belknap writes to St. George Tucker in Virginia saying, you know, most juries in Massachusetts, when these cases come up, they're letting these slaves free, much to the ire of slaveholders in Massachusetts who are seeing their property become increasingly unsafe. But what's interesting about Walker and Mumbet's case is that it goes to the Supreme Judicial Court. And William Cushing, who is the presiding judge, it's not a jury case, it's a judge, he interprets the Massachusetts state constitution as having abolished slavery. So now where does he, you know, get that?
Yeah.
When Mumbet is put on the stand, she says in her testimony that I have heard that we have a state constitution, a new state constitution in 1780 that has a Bill of Rights and therefore slavery. And she actually evokes natural rights. Again, not maybe in the most sophisticated legal discourse, but the fact again that she has the political sophistication to evoke that is quite interesting. And then if you see the memoirs of the Sedgwick family, Theodore Sedgwick is the anti-slavery lawyer who argues the case, and his daughter and son become abolitionists. And they say, we became abolitionists because of this woman, she was just so remarkable.
Wow.
You know, and then she gets married to a Du Bois, a Burghardt, a guy, a Revolutionary War soldier, who's like 20 years her junior or something. And she was an amazing woman too. And so W.E.B. Du Bois claimed that he was descended from Mumbet, but there's no direct blood descent.
Yeah.
But there is a connection because Burghardt had his own kids, and in fact W.E.B. Du Bois is descended from that Burghardt family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
The more you read this stuff, it's like, yeah. This is why you should be historians and do research. It's like it's
Fascinating.
Great connections. Yeah, but I think Cushing really did, because then I found another instance where Cushing's own slave told him that, you know, I'm going to walk out on you. and I think that case was kind of hushed. So it's not as if Cushing himself
Was super enlightened.
Oh, I mean, let's give him credit that he became enlightened on this, but it's not as if it came out of his commitment. You know, maybe this is the way history is taught, right?
Yes.
Oh, these people are so enlightened, and suddenly they're inflicted with revolutionary values, and they become their eyes are open. Well, no, it's, you know, dealing actually with African Americans who are making these freedom claims constantly that I think does, again, I make that argument in the book, but I think there's enough evidence to back it up.
Great. Thank you. That's a great story. Appreciate it.
I have kind of a disciplinarily selfish question to ask, I think. As a literature scholar, I was astonished to turn to histories of slavery, or histories of anti-slavery, rather, and find how conservative they were. And so...
now you know how I felt.
Well, and so that's my question, is I'm curious if we can now see it with new eyes because of maybe history having taken a bit of a discursive turn in some ways, that this might be a little bit of a kind of overlap of the disciplines as history started to resemble English a bit more and as English started to resemble history a bit more, right? We kind of met and found this radical middle in some ways that made these things more visible.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because you're absolutely right. I think historians have started taking print culture, text, more seriously. For a long time, historians were very dismissive of anything that's not like event-based history, right? But in a way, you can link them to events too. And it's just, there was all this talk that we're doing this new social history and history from the bottom up. And what I found was when I was writing the history of abolition, that it had really worked with slavery studies. Slavery studies, historians have become so sophisticated now in understanding various aspects of slavery. Every time we turn around, there's a new book that does a wonderful job with very scant evidence, sheds light on the history of slavery. It was not true of abolition. And part of it is that the abolitionists for so long have been demonized. I mean, the U.B. Phillips version of slavery has been challenged since the Second World War. I guess since racism became unfashionable, so maybe it's no longer that unfashionable. But as far as abolition studies were concerned, people who wrote histories of abolition tended to write it up in this whitewashed way, as it was just these whites, and not seeing their connections, and lacking what I call the charity principle that philosophers use when they try to understand something. And it maybe it took an outsider sort of viewing that history, because I was reading a history of this. My first book is all about Southern slaveholders, post-slavery ideology, and constitutional theory. So it maybe took an outsider's view, and it could be also because I really read a lot of the literary scholars, because when I was dealing with all these slave narratives, even some of the poetry. Abolition, all the abolitionist print culture. It's a huge and complicated historical archive. And I look to literary scholars because, when you're a historian, you read the historiography and then you do your research or whatever, or vice versa. But when it came to those texts, I turned to literary scholars because historians had really not paid them enough attention or respect. And many of them were written by African Americans. And this was one way in which African Americans could enter the public sphere or create what we increasingly see as the counter-public of the early American Republic. And for me, that it was really helpful. So I owe you a discipline, a debt of gratitude. Any other questions?
Yeah. Since you're writing a new history of abolitionism, what's like your biggest beef with the general consensus among historians? Like, if I could leave with some new imagined concepts of abolitionism, what would you want me to walk out with?
So that's a great question, actually, and a difficult one. But when I sort of read the ways in which abolitionists have been portrayed in current historiography, one of the main things that they argued was that these were really bourgeois reformers, that they were able to criticize slavery. They were armchair philosophers criticizing Southern slavery without having any idea about what it's like, and that was actually not true. There were abolitionists who ventured down south at a considerable risk and then wrote about it. Also, that they were conservative when it came to economic issues, and they were also racially paternalistic towards blacks. And to a certain extent, there was a lot of kind of romantic racialism involved with the ways in which some white abolitionists talked about African Americans. But African Americans are not, silent partners in this relationship. They call them out. We have enough documents of them calling out white abolitionists on their paternalism, and white abolitionists kind of being called to kind of defend themselves on this, right? So I think the biggest thing, my biggest beef was this notion that this was not a radical social movement, that this was some sort of evangelical religious movement with these individuals. Yeah, maybe there were some women, there were some blacks, but they were like there, the sides. The main image was that of bourgeois white abolitionists being extremely conservative, and I found that to be untrue. So the main takeaway that I want you to go out with is that to really understand abolition as a radical social movement, as a movement that epitomizes American democratic radicalism, and that was successful to a certain extent, and actually managed to implement its goals, not just of ending slavery, but of black rights, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The problem was not that the abolitionist vision was in any case, bad or insufficient. There are some abolitionists even talking about land redistribution. That was another part of the land reform movements that I couldn't talk about, those abolitionists who were involved in that. The fact is that their vision was overthrown, and it gives you a sense of how American democracy has progressed. So that would be the main takeaway. Think of abolition as a radical interracial movement that actually inspired subsequent generation of American radicals. So I have an epilogue to this book where I talk about how different American radical movements, starting with the Knights of Labor, to the Populists, to American Socialists, Eugene Debs' party, to the labor movement, to the civil rights activists, feminists, etc., have evoked the abolitionists to contemporary movements against human trafficking and unfree labor. So it's kind of a legacy, just a couple of, so that's the main takeaway. Go away understanding that this was a radical social movement with its shortcomings and its divisions and its diversity, etc. But that, that for a long time, I think historians tend to caricature the movement rather than understand it historically and seriously.
Do you think that this is I feel like it happens a lot, that the historiography tries to domesticate the most radical traditions within American political culture again and again and again, to sort of naturalize them as inevitable outgrowths of this American experiment.
Absolutely.
So that they become rationalized within that as normal and natural, right? Of course, and so it seems like it's a continual, it's an interesting ideological cultural phenomenon. It's persistent and strong.
This is such that's a great point. It's an absolutely great point, because our view of American history is this kind of linear, biggish progress of democracy, right? That's the textbook you read in high school, right? Or at school most of the time. And what one doesn't understand is that it is a contested process, that there is no linear progress, and that if you think of the expansion of American democracy, it has happened when ordinary citizens and radical movements have stood up and fought for certain rights and sought to get words that are seemingly empty or highly ironic. When it came to black people, land, the whole, free and brave, whatever. It must be ironic if you were a slave. You look at Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." That it took this kind of implementation that we have to understand. We have to have a more nuanced and complex view of the way American democracy has progressed, and the ways in which there has always been a reaction to those ideas. And interestingly enough, I think Obama said that in his farewell speech.
Yeah, he did say
and I was
that.
like, oh my God, maybe he read my book. But he had a very sophisticated understanding of how democracy had progressed in this fits and starts, and that it progresses not so much of what comes down from up above, because that's not the way democracy works, but when ordinary citizens are energized to fight for laws and to implement them. So and it just seems like a message for our times a little bit, but that is the big takeaway. I would definitely say that.
I was just thinking about the title of the book and its historiographical characterization of the abolitionist movement, and is there a distinction between an anti-slavery movement and an abolitionist movement?
Yeah, a great question. Yeah, absolutely. I have a chapter here called The Politics of Abolition, right? And this is what abolitionists actually fought about. And that's so interesting that they're fighting about this. When the movement splits between the Garrisonians and the political abolitionists form a political party, right? The idea is to work within the system to get abolition and black rights. But the Liberty Party, which was the abolitionist party, doesn't garner many votes. Yes, they're very powerful in upstate New York and Massachusetts and Ohio, where abolitionists have their bases, but they're not powerful. And there are abolitionists who argue that we need to have like the lowest common denominator of anti-slavery to actually get more northern whites interested in abolition. So yes, more northern whites are becoming more interested in abolition because of these confrontations, because of the gag rule, because anti-abolitionist mobs are linking the slaves' cause with the fight for white liberties even, right? Civil liberties, etc. But it doesn't happen until the Mexican War that people really start fearing the, quote, slave power, whether it's their expansion into the territories or their reaching into free states. So something like the federal fugitive slave law that criminalizes assisting fugitive slaves, right? And demands by law that if I am a marshal and I come into your town and I form a posse comitatus to, get a fugitive slave runaway, you as an adult white man have to join me, or you will be punished by fines or things. Those sorts of things, I think, really do lead to the spread of political anti-slavery in the white North. So I do make a difference, between them and the Free Soil and Republican parties. But I argue that we have to see this in a continuum. And what's interesting about the Republican Party, many people think that I talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction in this book. I actually don't. I ended 1860, or some of them complain, why doesn't she talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction? I'm like, wait a minute, this book is long enough. But, you can see how, again, a radical social movement is pushing on the left to move the Republican Party and Lincoln from non-extension of slavery to abolition of slavery to black rights, from colonization, which Lincoln believed in throughout the 1850s, to black rights and black citizenship during the war. So I see a connection, but I see them definitely as distinct, abolition and anti-slavery. I would not collapse some people are collapsing, some historians tend to collapse those differences, and I think that's also problematic. But then you lose the variety and the action, I think the true historical picture, it becomes more kind of a polemical point, but there is definitely a difference.
So I have a question. You said you're studying Reconstruction right now for a new book. So this question is kind of about that. Do you believe that on a whole, abolitionists were content with or satisfied with the outcome of the war and Reconstruction that followed?
That's a great question too. Really good question, because again it shows you that when your goals are achieved or partially achieved, the impact it has on the movement. So right now, I'm going back to high politics, I guess, going back to congressional politics and the ways in which it impacts on the abolitionists. So the abolitionists will no longer be the center of my story, because the center of the story this time really is Congress, right? So what happens after the war is once you have the 13th Amendment passed, so Garrison says, that's it, I'm done. He's kind of tired, his wife is ill. He also says, interesting, I think people keep trying to explain, why is Garrison doing this? Because he was always for black rights. And he lives a long time after this, right? And he continues to write for black rights. And he writes against Chinese exclusion laws. And he's writing right until he is literally on his deathbed, protesting things, right? He says, I was president of the American Anti-Slavery Society when it was unpopular. Now that it has become popular to be an abolitionist, I don't want to be president anymore. But he really does think that the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished, he's tired, he's old, whatever the reasons, he actually steps down. And the movement outgrows him, because both Douglas and Wendell Phillips say, no, we have to continue until we get black rights. So they continue until the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution that establishes, birthright citizenship, equality before the law, civil rights, and the 15th Amendment, which gives black men the right to vote, which again creates a split between abolitionists, feminists, and other abolitionists, right? When those amendments are passed, the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, Douglas and Phillips say, well, That's it. We've achieved our goals. Black citizenship, black equality. We want to disband the American Anti-Slave Society. There are a group of abolitionists, and this is not widely known, who say no. Land has to be redistributed to the former slaves, unless they are, because otherwise they are at the mercy of their former masters. They disagree with Phillips and Douglass, but Douglass and Phillips say no, and they win actually. The American Anti-Slavery disbands in 1870. And at that point, they could not have imagined that they had come so far and things would go backwards so quickly again, right? So by the end of the 1870s, so I wrote another piece about abolitionists who are writing in the aftermath of the downfall of Reconstruction, and their memoirs are not triumphalist. They're not like, look at what we've achieved. They actually, in a way, they are extremely sad to read because it's like everything we fought for has gone backwards, right? It's in a way the age that we are living in right now. You can't believe how far you can go and then how suddenly you're back in, square one. So, there is a moment, you can see how abolitionists deal with both the sort of the victories, which were significant during Reconstruction, and then with the downfall, the complete overturning of many of these laws, or simply the nullification of all federal laws and federal constitutions. There's still cases being fought today over the 14th Amendment and the 1866 Civil Rights Act. So these were important pieces of legislation, and abolitionists knew that. And so that is the impact of the movement, and the contestation over that kind of continues. There's no kind of simple happy ending, It sort of continues. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was asking.
Yeah.